certification of the district's 2011-2012 unaudited actual financial report. This information was pulled from our agenda item, from our agenda, 2 weeks ago, because it was not ready yet. So we are now, it has now been completed. So I will turn it over to Mr. Lawrence to, Mr. Richards to do the presentation.
Good evening, President Whitmarsh, members of the board. This one? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. Slide. It's kind of. That's all right. I think I can speak up enough for everybody to be able to hear. Tonight we bring forward to the Board of Education the unaudited actuals for 2011-2012. We have some unusual things that happened as far as the state's concerned, and that they actually passed an on-time budget. So the stuff for the budget is very little change from the last time that I was speaking to the board. When we adopted our budget, the state's adopted budget was very similar to what was in the May revise, in that if the state's revenues come in below projections, meaning the projection including Prop 30 passing, because that's what Governor Brown used in his budget, then there is the potential for a cut of about $441 per ADA for unified school districts if those revenues are not realized. And then if that revenue cut is triggered, then with it comes the ability to negotiate additional school year reduction days over the 5 that are already in law to bump that up to 20 days each year for this year and next year. We've already concluded negotiations with MDUSD, the board is aware, for up to 11-day reduction of the teacher year with the corresponding amounts to the rest of the employee groups if the state does have to take a cut. But meanwhile, that cut doesn't really affect what happened with the unaudited actuals. The unaudited actuals are really our final look at what happened in 2011-2012. The hard copies of the books that you have in front of you are different than what was posted up on the web. We did have some changes that were identified over the weekend, and I'll go through briefly what those are as we get to the various forms that we talk about. The one that had the most significant changes actually is Fund 1, so we're going to talk about it in detail. The revenue that came in for the year was at $201.1 million. It's about $400,000 more than we were projecting at estimated actuals. That came in the form of revenue limit dollars coming in a little bit high, federal coming in a little bit high, and local as well. So every piece had a little bit of additional revenue in it. I'm sorry, revenue limit was low, the others were high, that offset the revenue limit being short. On our expenditure side, again, we came in fairly close to where we projected all across the board, with salaries for certificated coming in a little bit high. Some of that related to the 3% right there at the end. Not all of that had gotten captured in the estimates when we were doing estimated actuals, but classified had been, and so it came in right about where we thought it would. Benefits came in a little bit favorable, about $1 million less than we had originally budgeted or projected. And books and supplies came in about $480,000 less than we had projected, and services and other operating came in about $1.2 million. So all in all, and significantly down at the bottom, contributions net to the categorical programs. The encroaching programs or the restricted programs that received contributions from the unrestricted general fund required about $2.8 million less in contributions than we had projected at estimated actuals. So our total expenditures came in at about $205 million. We still did have a deficit on the year, so our ending balance is going down from $45.5 to $41.7. Then we have our normal reservations for the revolving cash and stores for the inventory, as well as our 2% designation for economic uncertainties that we're required to maintain. Tier 3 and site carryovers came in about $750,000 higher than we anticipated. And then we have the additional reserve set aside to cover us for the state fiscal uncertainty. That's Prop 30, the difference between the cut to revenue and what we would save in the form of the furlough days that have already been negotiated. And there's more detail on that on the future screen. In the categorical programs, our restricted revenues came in quite a bit less than we project. That's normal. Because federal programs, we budget the entire amount of the grant, and if it isn't fully spent, rather than showing fund balance in a federal grant, you show a deferral of the revenue. So the revenue bounces forward as part of the carryover, but the current year revenue ends up dropping down to reflect the drop in the expenditures. So you see we have a rather substantial $7 million drop in federal revenue between the estimated actuals and the actuals, and that's the function of unspent federal revenues rolling into next year. And again, the unrestricted general fund contribution went down because the expenditures in the programs that normally receive a contribution were lower than we anticipated. So overall revenue is down just shy of $11 million. On the expenditure side, we see a corresponding reduction as well. Since the expenses were less, the revenue was less. Certificated salaries came in about 1.6 million below projection. Classifieds came in just slightly high. Benefits came in low, about 1.8 million. Books and supplies comes in substantially lower. That again is normal with the way that we do our accounting in this district. It's not the way every district does it, but for the grants where they're multi-year grants and they're planning on carrying it forward to a future year, they leave it in Object Code 4315, which is books and it's a subset of books and supplies, which is basically carryover for next year that's planned. And so since that carryover doesn't get spent, it gets rolled into next year. That's where you're seeing the reduction in the revenues compared to what had been budgeted or estimated. Similar declines with services and other operating, a little bit under in capital outlay. Indirect costs are lower because the expenditures are lower. Since indirect costs are a function of a percentage of the rest of the expenses, they come in low on the natural when expenditures don't fully meet. So we came in with about 15 million less in expenditures as well. But overall, the categorical programs did spend down some of their fund balance this year, not as much as we had initially projected that they would. So they end the year at about $12 million. The rest of the funds of the district are substantially unchanged with one exception from what was in the original book that went out to the hard copy book you just received, and that's Fund 11, Adult Education. One of the changes that we identified, actually Mrs. Durkee's staff identified it when they saw the initial numbers come out, was that we had actually overcharged them for indirect costs between Adult Ed and the general fund, so that got corrected. And then the rest of the corrections were some changes with regard to contributions in that we had overcalculated the contribution to special education this year. So we don't want to overly commit ourselves on going beyond what it needed to balance itself, and so we rebalanced special education. And the remainder of the funds are in good, healthy shape. The supplemental forms that come with it, there are a couple that are added that the board hasn't seen always in the past. It may have many years ago, but there are a couple of forms that we have traditionally not done within the state software, at least in the years prior to my coming and the first couple years that I was here. One in particular that you'll see in the book is Schedule CAT, which is the categorical schedule. It delineates all the different categorical programs and gives you an idea of what each one's individual revenue and expenditures were and what their carryover is. We actually have that form complete this year prior to the board book coming out, so it's now included. And at the very, very back of your book, the last two forms are Report GSNA and GSA, which are the government-wide Statement of Net Assets and the government-wide Statement of Activities. And you might recall that when the auditors do their presentation, they spend some time talking about our Statement of Net Assets and the conversion entries that happen to change us from fund accounting to full accrual accounting. Well, there's an ability within the state software now to actually do these calculations. And if the district does it for themselves before the audit's done, then we can include them in our financial report. And we did actually get it completed this year. So we have all of the information ahead of the board seeing the book. So although it's not a required report to go with the county with the report, since it's done, it's included, so you'll be able to see it. And much of this description is what you normally see on these forms when the audit comes out. And you'll see that same information coming. You're just getting it 3 months ahead of when you would normally get it. In response to one of the questions that was asked earlier during the transportation, I didn't want to interrupt the flow of Ms. Goki's presentation, but to answer one of the questions that was asked with regard to where would we see if expenditures have been moved and allocated between the programs. If you go back about 10 to 12 pages from the back of the book, you'll see Form TRAN, Form TRAN, that's the Transportation Detail